In the summer of 2014, Yu-Gi-Oh! Introduced Pendulum monsters into the game. These half-monster, half-spell cards featured strange symbols, unintuitive mechanics, and complicated rulings. This controversial addition caused many players to leave the game, but perhaps its biggest impact was irrevocably damaging how people would perceive Yu-Gi-Oh! As a brand even a decade later. If you're someone who quit the game when these cards were first released, then you might be surprised to learn just how much backtracking they've done to try and balance this mechanic. Today we're going to cover what made such a large amount of the community dislike Pendulums on release, and also how Yu-Gi-Oh! Addressed these complaints throughout the years. First impressions are important, especially with new mechanics, so let's start by talking about how Pendulum cards look. If we think back to Synchro monsters when those were released, they basically looked like normal cards, except they had a new color. Xyz monsters brought another new color to the game, and the stars moved to the left side of the card. Pendulums looked alien by comparison. These cards weren't quite monsters or spells, they were somewhere in between. They had two different effect text boxes, and they had scales. It was all very overwhelming for current players. Furthermore, to accommodate for these cards, they added two new Pendulum zones to the field, which was the first time that the layout had ever changed. To make room for the Pendulum zones, they pushed the field zone and graveyard up and moved the extra and main deck down. This was a frustrating change, not only because it looked bad, but also it made playing on older mats difficult because they no longer had the correct zones. Looks weren't the only problem though. Pendulum summoning just in general was way too complicated. Here's how Pendulum summoning worked when it was first introduced into the game. You'd place two Pendulums into the Pendulum zones to set up your scales. Then, once per turn, you were able to special summon monsters whose levels were between those two scales from your hand or face-up extra deck. Now you might be wondering, what is a face-up extra deck? Because prior to the release of Pendulums, the extra deck had always been face down. If a Pendulum card leaves the field and it would have gone to the graveyard, it instead goes to your extra deck face up. The face up portion of your extra deck was essentially a toolbox of monsters that you could special summon every single turn as long as you had the correct scales. At its best, Pendulum summoning let you special summon 5 monsters for free every single turn. For many players, Pendulum summoning perfectly encapsulated everything wrong with Yu-Gi-Oh! The cards were confusing and had too much text, the rulings were difficult to understand for old and new players alike, and of course, special summoning 5 monsters for free every turn sounded terrifying. The problem was only amplified when they started to bring in Pendulum extra deck monsters. These Fusion, Synchro, and Xyz Pendulums start in your extra deck face down, and then after you summon them normally, they go to the extra deck face up when they leave the field. Admittedly, these are some of the most mechanically weird cards in the entire game. Luckily, they haven't printed too many of these cards, and the vast majority of them have never seen competitive use. Regardless, these cards are an easy scapegoat for many players' frustrations. I've yet to see a Nirvana High Paladin summoned at a real tournament, but it sure makes for a good thumbnail monster if you want to get players mad. All of the complaints that we've talked about so far are completely valid, and I don't blame anyone for quitting the game when Pendulums were released. You're not required to learn every new thing that a card game throws at you, but rather it's the game's job to keep you interested enough to want to learn their new mechanics. While every new summoning method has been met with some criticism, I think that with Pendulums specifically, they mostly just pushed away older fans without really bringing in a lot of new players to replace them. That being said, even though a lot of players permanently left the game because of how overpowered they thought Pendulums would be, the reality of early Pendulums was a bit different. As you would expect with any new mechanic, they immediately released a lot of Pendulum monsters. However, during the entire first year of Pendulums, there was only one competitive Pendulum deck, and it was usually considered the 3rd or 4th best deck in the format. The Cleefort deck was many players' introduction to the Pendulum mechanic, but it was a strange ambassador because it didn't really care about special summoning. It used Cleefort Scout and Sacrifice to slowly build up advantage while hiding behind floodgates such as Skill Drain and Vanity's Emptiness. The Cleefort cards were particularly strong with Emptiness because they went to the extra deck when when they left the field, which dodged Emptiness's self-destruction drawback. While Qliphorts did often end games with one big Pendulum summon that they built up to over several turns, a lot of the time they won without special summoning at all. The deck was very good, but it got demolished by the spell and trap removal that players were packing into their side decks. We did receive stronger Pendulum decks throughout the years, but you weren't required to play them to win at tournaments. Most formats had a couple Pendulum decks in the meta, but there were always other options. There was a very brief period in time in early 2016 where a Pendulum deck was way too overpowered, but luckily they quickly addressed it by dropping an emergency ban list. The absolute Pendulum takeover that so many players feared did not happen, but the damage had already been done. Most of the players that quit because of Pendulums weren't going to come back because by that point for them, the Yu-Gi-Oh brand had been forever tarnished. I'm sure there's people watching this video right now that didn't realize how unpopular Pendulums were at events after their release. And it's not their fault, of course, because why would they keep up with tournament results for a game that they already quit? We'll never know for sure, but I would imagine that behind closed doors, the designers were frantically trying to figure out a solution to the Pendulum problem. Unfortunately though, it's not like someone could just snap their fingers and remove Pendulums from the game entirely because the mechanic was tied to the anime. That being said, it's clear that somebody in charge noticed how the players reacted to Pendulums, and in 2017, everything changed. The reign of the full power Pendulum mechanic came crashing down with the release of Link Monsters. This is another mechanic that initially didn't go over well with the community, but for right now, I want to focus on the two big changes that affected Pendulums directly. With the release of Link Summoning, they removed the floating Pendulum zones. Going forward, the Pendulum zones would now be in the left and rightmost spell and trap zones if you were playing Pendulums, otherwise they were just regular zones. Without a doubt, this is how it should have been from the very beginning. Pretty much everyone was in favor of this change because it was a lot more intuitive and less intrusive. Additionally, you could now only special summon monsters from the extra deck to the new extra monster zone or to a spot where a link arrow pointed. This greatly restricted Pendulum summoning, and it essentially deleted the issue of Pendulum summoning 5 monsters every turn for free. Competitive Pendulum decks still existed even after these changes were implemented, but their most broken mechanics had been significantly dialed back. Generally speaking, people were happy with the new restrictions on Pendulums. However, players didn't like that these summoning restrictions also affected Fusion, Synchro, and Xyz monsters. A few years later, near the end of 2021, they once again updated the rules, and this time they lifted the restrictions for Fusion, Synchro, and Xyz monsters, but not Pendulums or Links. By that point, players had already theorized that Link summoning was specifically designed to restrict Pendulums, and this change all but confirmed it. That was a while ago though, so let's talk about the state of Pendulums today. It's been years since a dedicated Pendulum deck was a consistent meta threat, and it's been even longer since one was considered the best deck of a format. New Pendulum archetypes do pop up from time to time, but most of them have been rogue options at best. Many of the recently released successful Pendulum cards have been included in decks that don't really play a lot of other Pendulums. For example, Super Heavy Samurai Wakaushi is a strong combo enabler that can be splashed into a variety of strategies, but usually it's one of only 2 Pendulums in the decks that run it. Similarly, the Melodious archetype received 2 Pendulum monsters that helped transform the deck into a tournament-topping option, but those are the only 2 Pendulums in the entire theme. The vast majority of newer sets support the theory that they want us to erase Pendulums from our memory completely. Infinite Forbidden only featured 2 Pendulums in the entire set, and Rage of the Abyss only had 1. The Quarter Century Bonanza reprint set, which had almost 300 cards in it, included 0 Pendulum cards. A lot of players don't like Pendulums, and it seems like the set designers know that. Players have to really go out of their way to play a Pendulum deck these days, and I believe believe that's on purpose. Nobody is obligated to enjoy modern Yu-Gi-Oh, but if you are someone that quit the game because of Pendulums, then I hope this video was able to show you that the game didn't go down the dark path that many players predicted. I don't love Pendulums, and I've never shown up to a tournament with a Pendulum deck, but I think there's way too much fear-mongering when it comes to this mechanic. If Pendulums were the main thing keeping you from getting back into Yu-Gi-Oh, then I recommend giving it another chance. The current era of Yu-Gi-Oh has its fair share of issues, but Pendulums aren't really one of them. Anyway, that's gonna wrap it up for today's video. I really want to get back into posting discussion videos in 2025, so watch out for more of them. They'll be on the way. I'll catch you guys later though. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.